It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway. Just me, Max, and Jake. The three of us had been inseparable since childhood, always causing mischief, always having each other's backs. Max was the adventurous one, always dragging us into trouble, while Jake and I would reluctantly follow. But none of us could have known how this trip would change everything. We had decided to rent an old mansion, hidden deep in the woods, far away from the world. It seemed like the perfect place to escape the noise of life, to unwind. But when we arrived, the atmosphere hit me in a way I hadn't expected. The house looked abandoned, as if it had been forgotten by time itself. The windows were cracked, the paint peeling, and the doors creaked like the whispers of ghosts. But Max, ever the thrill-seeker, convinced us it would be fun. The storm had come out of nowhere. By the time we decided to head back, the wind howled like a wild animal, and the sky turned a sickly shade of gray. The rain battered against the windows, and the house seemed to groan and shift under the pressure. We were trapped. But instead of fear, there was excitement in Max's eyes. It was almost like he was anticipating something. We tried to settle in, but it felt wrong. The air was thick with a strange tension, the kind of feeling you get when you know something's lurking just out of sight. Jake noticed it too, his face pale, his hands shaking, but Max, he was different. He didn't seem scared. In fact, it felt like he was feeding off the unease around us. As the night dragged on, the house became more alive in ways I can't explain. The shadows on the walls moved like they were breathing. I heard strange noises in the hallways, whispers, faint but unmistakable. The wind, or was it the house? It was as if something was waiting. But Max brushed it off as usual. "It's just an old house," he'd say, trying to convince us that we were just being paranoid. But the whispers didn't stop. And soon, they weren't just whispers. They were voices, low, guttural, speaking in a language I couldn't understand. And then, Jake, he started acting strange too. He kept looking over his shoulder, like he was seeing something we couldn't. His eyes darted nervously, and I could see the fear creeping in, just under the surface. At first, I thought maybe it was just the storm messing with our heads. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The house, the storm, the whispers, they were all connected. And then Max did something that chilled me to my bones. I found him in the study, the light from the flickering candle casting long shadows across his face. His hands were shaking, and there was a strange, feverish look in his eyes. I asked him what was wrong, and he didn't answer at first. Then, he pulled something out of his bag, an old, weathered book. It looked ancient, covered in dust, and before I could say anything, he began reading from it. His voice was soft, almost hypnotic, but it sent a wave of terror through me. I tried to stop him, but it was like he wasn't even listening. His eyes were glazed over, his mind somewhere else entirely. "What is that, Max?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Where did you get that?" He didn't respond. He just kept chanting. The air grew colder, the wind outside picked up, and the shadows around us began to shift, stretching, moving. I could feel the temperature drop, and my heart started pounding in my chest. It was then I realized something was horribly wrong. Max wasn't trying to get us out of here. He wasn't even thinking about escape. No, Max had come here for a different reason, something far darker. I turned to Jake, trying to make sense of it. "Jake, what's happening? What's going on?" But he was staring at Max, his face frozen with a look of pure fear. "Jake?" I called again, my voice rising in panic. But he didn't respond. He was in some kind of trance, his body rigid, his eyes empty. Then Max spoke again, and this time his voice was cold, almost unrecognizable. "We have to do it," he said, barely above a whisper. "It's the only way." I backed away, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. "Do what?" I asked, but he didn't answer. He just kept chanting, louder now, his words more urgent. "What are you doing, Max?" I demanded, my voice breaking. He turned to me, his eyes wide, filled with desperation and terror. "You don't understand," he said, his voice shaking. "We're not going to make it out unless we do this. We have to sacrifice one of us." My stomach dropped, the room spun, and I stumbled back. "What?" I gasped, my voice barely a whisper. "Max, no, you can't be serious." Jake finally snapped out of his trance, his voice raw with panic. But Max didn't hesitate. He looked at Jake, his face cold, as if the decision had already been made. "It has to be you," he said, the words so cold, so deliberate. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. My mind screamed for us to run, but my body wouldn't obey. And then I saw it, the shadow behind Max. It moved, stretching unnaturally, growing larger. The air became thick with the smell of decay, of something ancient and evil. "You can't do this," Jake said, his voice shaking with fear. You're my best friend." Max didn't even flinch. "I have no choice," he said, his voice like a death sentence. "We don't survive this unless I make a choice." That's when I realized. Max had never been afraid. He had always known what was happening. He'd been planning this from the start. The whispers, the strange behavior, the book, it was all leading to this moment. He had been using us, setting us up for this. "Max, please, don't do this," I begged, my voice a desperate plea. But it was too late. Max was already moving, grabbing Jake by the arm, pulling him toward the center of the room. "Max, no, please." I screamed, but it didn't matter. He was already too far gone. And then the chant reached its peak. The ground beneath us trembled, and the shadows came alive. I felt a presence in the room, something ancient, something evil. The walls closed in on me, and the lights flickered, casting long, twisted shadows across the room. Suddenly, everything went black. When I woke, I was alone. The storm had stopped. The mansion was silent, like nothing had ever happened. But the whispers were still there, echoing in my head, haunting me. Where was Max? Where was Jake? I stumbled to my feet, my legs weak, my mind in a haze. And that's when I saw him. Max was lying on the floor, his eyes wide open but lifeless. His body was twisted, his mouth hanging open in a silent scream. The sacrifice had worked, but not in the way he had hoped. The ghosts had claimed him. But it wasn't just him. It wasn't just the house. I looked around, my heart racing. The shadows seemed to close in, and I could feel them, behind me, around me. They were watching, waiting. And then it hit me. The house hadn't wanted to let us leave. It had wanted something far worse, something we didn't understand. And Max had been its final choice. The door opened slowly, creaking as if it was protesting. And that's when I saw the faces, dozens of faces, pale and distorted, floating in the doorway. They weren't Max or Jake. They were something else, something worse. I turned to run, but the walls closed in, the darkness swallowing me whole. And I realized with a sickening certainty that I was next.